Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We have been discussing the origins and specifically the history of where the beliefs about origins have come from. Yesterday, we talked about everything starting back in ancient history with fixity of a species all the way up until uniformitarianism. At that time period, shifts of ideas started to happen, and you had the introduction of someone that you probably have heard of before, and that is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, early on, was actually studying to become a priest. He, however, used to get in trouble because he would be trying to study the different animals that were surrounding him instead of doing his proper work. He didn't really want to be a priest. Lots of times in that time period, if you were well educated, it was either you became a soldier, a doctor, a lawyer, or a priest, and possibly a teacher. So he was probably told he was going to become a priest. However, he ended up not becoming a priest, left college where he was studying to become one, and became a naturalist. Now, a naturalist by today's scientific world would kind of be the idea of an environmentalist. They would be going around the world, literally, as you can tell from the map, and they would be studying all these different types of creatures, both plants and animals and everything else, while they traveled the world. They did not have cameras. So Charles Darwin, while he was traveling on the HMS Beagle, would be making drawings of these different animals and plants. He would be writing down observations about how they acted, what they did, what they ate, just about anything that you could think of that would nowadays be in a textbook. That is what his job was to travel around with these ships and to get information about a lot of things. It was what he loved, and he actually was pretty good at it. He was a good artist as well. Feel free to go look up some of his artwork. It still exists. He also would collect samples of some of these organisms. So he'd catch birds or small animals, possibly some larger, and they would be preserved and put into taxidermy. They'd be stuffed so that they could be studied later and observed firsthand by people that didn't have the opportunity to see them. We usually think just about the Galapagos Islands. The reality is that's just one little area right over here near South America. Actually, they belong to Ecuador. But he actually traveled throughout the entire world. He started up here in England, went down around South America, went off, traveled around the world, and then came back by way of Australia, hopped off briefly at South America, and then went home again. Now, you have to realize we often just, we don't think of a trip on a boat as a big deal. Realize from these dates he was traveling for about 5 years. Okay, so it was a long time. We usually think just about the Galapagos with the tortoises and the finches. However, he had a fascination with beetles, with plants that were able to eat insects. He loved capuchin monkeys, and strangely, to my opinion, barnacles is what he was interested in. Now, in all of his studies, he noticed similarities among some of the birds and things on the Galapagos Islands. And he was fascinated with the Galapagos Islands because the animals and things were separated from pretty much everything else, so they were kind of different than everywhere else. The similarities he noticed led to the idea of descent with modification. The idea that at one point a group of finches, a small group, maybe a pair or something like that, traveled the long distance to these islands far away from land, possibly from a storm or something like that, and that as they bred over the multitudinous generations, you ended up with these different looking birds. Still birds, but the idea being that they all possibly came from a common ancestor. That is how Darwin talked about descent with modification. Modification just means change, so that there's little changes over time. What Darwin didn't realize at the time is that what we now know is the types of beaks of these birds actually is related to how good the weather is on the Galapagos Islands, and that the different numbers of birds changes for the different types depending on what's available to eat, even within one type of bird. However, what has come to be known as descent with modification is literally that all living things come from a common ancestor. So the belief has come to mean that at one point there was a substance in what kind of looked like an ocean, and conditions were right. Proteins came together in such a way that eventually you had a living thing, and that somehow that living thing replicated, had offspring, and over huge numbers of time you ended up with all the different species that you know of today, plant and animal, and saying that every living thing came from one thing. Another idea that Charles Darwin had was called survival of the fittest, which you've probably heard of before, and that is the idea that certain traits help organisms survive. You can see the quote there. It says, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one that's most responsive to change." In other words, one that can adapt. So the idea of being fittest is changing to be whatever needs to be. And that over time, those organisms will survive and pass on their genes. Now, Lamarck had the idea that giraffes changed because they tried. Now, Darwin and a man named Wallace had the belief that originally you had lots of different heights of giraffes, and that over time, what ended up happening is because you have tall giraffes that were able to reach more food, more of the tall giraffes survived, and all the short-necked ones died off. That would be their explanation of why you don't see short-necked type giraffes anymore, whereas we do have some fossils that show them. Okay, so the outcome of Lamarck's view and of Darwin and Wallace's view was basically the same, but a very different mechanism. Lamarck, they grew and they grew, they stretched, they tried. Darwin and Wallace, the idea being that the tall ones survived, the short ones starved to death. Okay, probably wondering who Wallace is. Alfred Wallace, was about the same time as Charles Darwin. They actually both came up with a theory of natural selection individually. The process of natural selection is related to what we talked about before, that the fittest organisms are likely to pass on the trait to the next generation. The example that you see in front of you is based on a town in the past that had a lot of coal production in the area. On the left side, what you see is the natural color of the tree bark, and you see the dark moth and the light moth. And they would say in that scenario, the